The ocean keeps its secrets buried deep. But on August 29, 2014, as Hurricane Isaac tore through the Louisiana coastline, it decided to give one back. The storm was a monstrous, churning force of nature, a symphony of roaring wind and crashing waves that clawed at the land with relentless fury. It ripped apart homes, flooded towns, and reshaped the very geography of the coast. For 20 years, the Gulf Stream jetty had stood as a monument of concrete and steel, a man-made shield against the sea's temper. That night, however, the sea reminded everyone who was truly in charge. The structure that was built to tame the ocean was being systematically dismantled by it, piece by agonizing piece, revealing that some foundations are not as strong as they appear. In the gray, debris-strewn dawn that followed the hurricane's retreat, the air was thick with the smell of salt, mud, and loss. Recovery crews moved through the devastation like ghosts, their yellow slickers a stark contrast to the muted tones of the ruined landscape. One worker, a man named Henderson, was tasked with assessing the damage to the now shattered jetty. He walked along the fractured concrete, his boots crunching on broken shells and displaced rebar, the scale of the destruction immense and impersonal. It was a routine job in the aftermath of a storm, a grim accounting of what the water had reclaimed. He expected to find nothing more than structural failures and erosion, the predictable scars left behind by a Category 1 hurricane that had punched well above its weight. But then he saw it. Amidst a chaotic pile of concrete rubble from what was once a foundational pylon, there was a cavity. It wasn't a clean break. It looked less like damage and more like a carefully constructed void, a hollow space that had been deliberately sealed within the massive block. The edges were too uniform, the shape too precise to be an accident of the storm. It was as if the concrete had been poured around a hidden chamber, a secret tomb that Isaac's fury had cracked open for the first time in 2 decades. Henderson paused, his professional curiosity piqued by the anomaly. This wasn't storm damage. This was something else entirely. Something that had been hidden from sight, waiting for a force strong enough to bring it into the light. Driven by an instinct he couldn't quite name, Henderson knelt down, the wet concrete cold against his knees. He reached a gloved hand into the dark, damp opening, his fingers brushing against something smooth and pliable, completely alien to the rough texture of the surrounding concrete and twisted metal. He carefully pulled it out. It was a heavy-duty, waterproof satchel, the kind used by sailors and deep-sea divers to protect their most valuable items from the unforgiving sea. It was covered in a thin layer of grime and algae, but astonishingly, it was perfectly intact. The bag felt heavy, substantial, a vessel of preservation against the crushing weight of concrete and the relentless passage of 20 years submerged in darkness. Its contents a complete and utter mystery. With a sense of reverence, he unsealed the bag. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and leather, a scent from another time. Inside, nestled in the protected darkness, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound logbook. The cover was embossed with the faint outline of a lighthouse, its surface weathered by time but not by water. The pages were yellowed at the edges, but the ink was dark and clear, the handwriting a steady, determined script. This was a lighthouse keeper's log, a daily record of tides, weather, and passing ships. But as Henderson flipped through the crisp pages, he could tell it was much more than that. It was a voice, perfectly preserved, that had been silenced long ago, a story entombed in concrete and waiting for this exact moment to be told. The story began in a different time, October 1994. The air off the Louisiana coast was cooler, but a different kind of storm was brewing. At the old Point Hofer Reef Lighthouse, Samuel Vance dipped his pen in ink. He wasn't just the keeper of the light. He was the guardian of the coast, a man whose family had watched over these waters for generations. He wrote not of the wind or the tides, but of the mechanical groan of construction barges and the methodical pounding of pile drivers. He was documenting the birth of the Gulf Stream jetty, a project he had fought with every fiber of his being, a concrete scar he believed would poison the delicate wetlands he called home. His logbook was his confidant in a fight that was growing more isolated and more dangerous by the day. Samuel was a man of quiet principles, deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world around him. He saw the jetty project not as progress, but as an invasion led by a man named Warren Croft, a developer with a charismatic smile and an insatiable appetite for profit. In his logbook, Samuel detailed the ecological devastation he witnessed daily, the dredging that clouded the pristine waters, the disruption to the shrimp breeding grounds, the slow death of the marsh grass. He wrote with the precision of a scientist and the soul of a poet, chronicling the loss of a way of life that was being paved over by greed. His entries were a testament to his unwavering resistance, a lonely protest against a tide of corruption that threatened to wash everything away. But Samuel's logbook was more than just a record of his environmental crusade. It was a dossier. He had been secretly gathering evidence, documenting how Croft's company, Gulfstream Holdings, was cutting corners to maximize their profits. He noted the substandard sand being mixed into the concrete, the cheaper, corrosion-prone rebar being used in the pylons, and the rushed, shoddy workmanship hidden beneath the surface. Each entry was a carefully recorded observation, dated and detailed, forming a damning account of corporate malfeasance. He knew the jetty was not just an ecological disaster waiting to happen. It was a structural one, a ticking time bomb of faulty materials and fraudulent practices. He was building a case, page by page, against one of the most powerful men in the state. Now, 20 years later, that same logbook lay on an evidence table at the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office. Its journey from the heart of a concrete pylon to this sterile room was nothing short of a miracle. The book was a time capsule, a voice from the past that had outlasted its author. Samuel Vance had vanished on October 12, 1994, just 2 days after his final frantic entry. His boat was found adrift, the official investigation concluding he was the victim of a tragic accident at sea, his body never recovered. The case was closed, but the questions never truly went away. Now, this logbook, delivered by a hurricane, was poised to provide the answers, promising to reveal that Samuel Vance's disappearance was no accident. It was the beginning of an earthquake that would shake a powerful empire to its very core. The phone call came on a Tuesday. For Clara Vance, it was a day like any other, filled with the clean lines and calculated angles of her life as an architect in New Orleans. She was reviewing blueprints for a new riverfront development, a world of concrete and steel not so different from the one her father had fought against. The caller identified himself as Detective Boudreau from the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office. The name of the parish alone was enough to make her breath catch. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, but his words dismantled the carefully constructed piece of her life. They had found something. Personal effects belonging to her father, Samuel Vance. 20 years of carefully managed grief, of quiet acceptance, shattered in a single, unbelievable moment. The past wasn't buried. It had just been waiting. The 2-hour drive to Iberia Parish was a surreal journey through a landscape of ghosts. The familiar cypress swamps and sprawling wetlands, once the backdrop of her childhood, now seemed to whisper forgotten stories. Every mile marker was a step back in time, peeling away the years and the professional facade she had built around her heart. She was 8 years old again, waiting on a dock for a boat that never returned. The official story had been a cruel, ambiguous comfort, a tragic accident at sea. But the whispers in the small coastal town were crueler, suggesting he had simply left, abandoning his family and his fight. That narrative had clung to her like the humid Louisiana air, a shadow of shame she could never quite outrun. Now, that shadow was about to either dissipate or grow into something far more menacing. The Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office was a low, unremarkable brick building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was a place for processing mundane tragedies, not for resurrecting ghosts from 2 decades past. Detective Boudreau was younger than she expected, with kind eyes that couldn't quite mask the professional curiosity of a man who had stumbled upon a legendary local mystery. He led her into a small, windowless room, the air thick with unspoken questions. He spoke with a gentle formality, explaining the circumstances of the discovery, the hurricane, the damaged jetty, the construction worker who found the cavity. Each word was a careful footstep around the raw wound of her family's history, a history he was now an unwitting custodian of. Clara listened, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, bracing for the impact. On the sterile metal table between them sat the waterproof satchel. It was dark, stained with grime and the memory of the deep, but it was whole. It was a relic, a time capsule from a world before she was forced to grow up. Detective Boudreau slid it slowly across the table. For a moment, Clara couldn't bring herself to touch it. This object had been with her father in his final moments. It had shared his fate, sealed in darkness, waiting. To touch it was to acknowledge the finality of his absence, to accept that the faint, childish hope she never admitted to having, that he might one day walk back into her life, was gone forever. With a trembling hand, she finally reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold, resilient material that had protected its contents for so long. It was found inside one of the jetty's foundation pylons, the detective said, his voice soft but clear. The words hung in the air, heavy with a terrible, poetic irony. The Gulf Stream jetty. The concrete monster her father had called a, quote, monument to greed. He had fought its construction with every fiber of his being, predicting the ecological ruin it would bring. He saw it as a symbol of corruption, a physical manifestation of Warren Croft's soulless ambition. To learn that this very structure, his nemesis, had held his last words captive was a cruel twist of fate. It wasn't just a clue, it was a message. The jetty hadn't just destroyed the coastline he loved, it had swallowed the man himself, silencing him within its cold, artificial heart. With a deep, shuddering breath, Clara unsealed the bag. A faint, musty scent escaped, the smell of old paper, leather, and the sea, the smell of her father's study in the old lighthouse. It was an olfactory ghost, so potent it brought instant tears to her eyes. Inside, perfectly preserved, was the logbook. She lifted it out, with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. The leather cover was cool and smooth. Beneath her fingertips, the embossed image of the Pointe-au-Fer Reef Lighthouse, faded but distinct. This was his. She remembered him writing in it every evening, his brow furrowed in concentration. The scratching of his pen, a familiar, comforting sound against the backdrop of crashing waves. This object was not just a book, it was a piece of her childhood, a tangible link to the man she barely remembered but had never stopped missing. Her fingers, shaking slightly, opened the cover. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was a bold, unfaded black. It was his handwriting, strong, precise, and utterly familiar. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she read the first few entries. 9 September 15th, 1994. High tide at 6:22 a.m., wind out of the southeast at 15 knots. A pod of dolphins played near the reef at dawn. It was his voice, speaking to her across a chasm of 20 years. It was so mundane, so normal, that it felt like a dream. She could almost feel his presence in the room, hear him describing the simple, profound beauty of the world he had cherished. For a moment, he wasn't a mystery or a tragedy. He was just her father, meticulously recording the rhythms of his life, a life that was about to be violently interrupted. Detective Boudreau cleared his throat, pulling her back to the grim reality of the present. The official report from '94 concluded he was lost at sea during a squall, quote, he stated, sliding a thin, worn file across the table. His boat was found adrift, no signs of foul play. The case was closed. He paused, his gaze fixed on the logbook in her hands. But this changes the narrative. A man preparing for a storm might secure his log, but he wouldn't hide it in a block of wet concrete. This wasn't an accident, Ms. Vance. This was a deliberate act. Someone wanted this book, and your father, to disappear forever. The implicit promise hung in the air. The official story was a lie, and the truth was finally within reach. Her eyes scanned the pages, jumping forward in time. The calm observations of the natural world gave way to something darker. The entries grew shorter, more urgent. She saw notes about construction barges, mentions of substandard materials, and one name repeated with growing intensity: Warren Croft. Then, her finger stopped on the entry for October 10th, 1994, just 2 days before he vanished. The handwriting was slightly less steady, charged with a nervous energy. He wrote of a meeting, of a $50,000 bribe offered and refused. And then, the final, chilling sentence. He gave me an ultimatum. He knows I have proof of the faulty materials. If I don't shut up, he'll shut me up. The air left Clara's lungs. The vague specter of an accident was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp image of a man silenced for what he knew. This logbook was no longer just a collection of memories. It was an indictment. It was a voice from the grave, a meticulously documented account of her father's final battle. For 2 decades, she had been the daughter of a man who disappeared, a man who might have abandoned his family. Now she held the proof that he was a man who was murdered for his principles. In that sterile room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, a new resolve settled over her. The grief was still there, a hollow ache in her chest, but it was now forged into a weapon. Her father had left her a map, a mission. She would follow it to the end. She would not just clear his name. She would make sure the world knew who he was and why he died. Clutching the logbook as if it were the most precious object in the world, Clara walked out of the sheriff's office and into the blinding Louisiana sun. The world felt both alien and hyper-focused. The weight of the book in her arms was the weight of a 20-year-old promise. Her father's fight was now her fight. The man who had built an empire on her family's pain, Warren Croft, would finally have to answer for the secret he had buried in concrete. She was no longer just an architect who designed buildings. She was the inheritor of a legacy, tasked with dismantling the corrupt foundation of a powerful man's life. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, but this was just the start of everything that was to come. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you think you could bear the weight of discovering your father, who you thought abandoned you, was actually silenced for trying to do the right thing? The path ahead for Clara was filled with danger and powerful enemies. If you want to follow this journey to uncover the truth, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think happened to Samuel Vance. To understand the storm that unearthed Samuel Vance's secret, you have to go back to a quieter time, to the Louisiana coast of 1994. It was a world defined by the steady rhythm of the tides and the cry of gulls, a place where generations had made their living from the bounty of the Gulf. At the heart of this world stood the Point Au Fer Reef Lighthouse, a lonely sentinel watching over the delicate wetlands. Its keeper was Samuel Vance, a man who seemed as much a part of the landscape as the cypress trees and the marsh grass. He wasn't just an employee of the Coast Guard. He was a steward, a biologist by training, and a naturalist by soul. His family had tended the light for nearly a century, and he saw the coast not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living entity to be protected. Into this world of natural balance came a force of a different kind, Warren Croft. Young, charismatic, and brimming with ambition, Croft was the founder of Gulfstream Holdings, a construction firm with grand designs for the Louisiana coastline. His centerpiece project was the Gulfstream Jetty, a massive breakwater that promised to tame the Gulf, create a deep water channel for shipping, and open up the region to unprecedented development. To his investors and many in the economically struggling local communities, Croft was a visionary, a man bringing jobs, progress, and prosperity. He sold a dream of a modern, thriving coast, shielded from the whims of nature by the might of concrete and steel. His vision was powerful, seductive, and in direct opposition to everything Samuel Vance held sacred. The battle lines were drawn quickly. Samuel saw the jetty for what it was, an ecological death sentence. He argued passionately in town hall meetings and in letters to the local paper that the project would destroy the shrimp breeding grounds, accelerate coastal erosion, and poison the wetlands with industrial runoff. He wasn't alone, but his was the most persistent and articulate voice of opposition. He organized small protests, gathering a loyal following of shrimpers and fishermen, like his old friend Earl Thibodeau, who feared their way of life was being paved over. The community was split. For every family that saw salvation in Croft's promises, there was another that saw the destruction of their heritage. The air grew thick with tension, a quiet civil war simmering under the humid Louisiana sky. For 8-year-old Clara Vance, this complex conflict was much simpler. Her world was the Lighthouse, a magical tower where the sea and sky met. Her father was the man who kept the light shining, a hero who could name every bird and predict the weather by the color of the clouds. She remembered the scent of salt and ink in his study, the comforting scratch of his pen in the logbook each evening. She would sit at his feet, listening to stories of the ocean's mysteries, oblivious to the storm of a different nature gathering on the horizon. Warren Croft was just a name she heard her father mention with a worried frown, a distant figure from the world of men in suits, a world that seemed to have no place in the timeless sanctuary of their life by the sea. As the summer of 1994 bled into autumn, the construction of the jetty began in earnest. The rhythmic pounding of pile drivers became the new, unwelcome heartbeat of the coast, a constant reminder of the encroaching change. Samuel grew more determined, his activism escalating from public appeals to a private investigation. He began documenting every violation, every shortcut he observed from his vantage point in the lighthouse. He took photographs of murky water plumes from the dredging and collected samples of what he suspected was substandard sand being mixed into the concrete. He was no longer just a protester. He was a man gathering evidence, building a case against an opponent who was far more powerful and, as he would soon learn, far more ruthless than he could have ever imagined. Samuel Vance was a man of quiet conviction. He wasn't prone to grand speeches or dramatic gestures. His power lay in his meticulous attention to detail and his unshakable integrity. He believed in facts, in the observable truth of the world around him. His logbook, which had for years been a simple record of weather patterns and passing ships, slowly transformed into a dossier. He documented dates, barge numbers, and conversations overheard on his radio. He was fighting Warren Croft not with anger, but with data. He believed that if he could just present the undeniable proof of the ecological damage and the fraudulent construction practices, the truth would prevail. It was a noble, almost naive belief in a world where money and influence often spoke louder than facts. Warren Croft, on the other hand, was a master of perception. He presented himself as a benefactor, a son of Louisiana who had made his fortune and returned to lift up his home state. He sponsored local festivals, donated to political campaigns, and had the sheriff on his payroll. He expertly framed Samuel's opposition as the sentimental whining of a man who couldn't accept progress. In public, he was patient and reasonable, dismissing the lighthouse keeper's concerns with a charming smile. In private, his frustration grew. Samuel Vance was becoming more than an annoyance. He was a genuine threat to the carefully constructed empire of kickbacks and corner-cutting that was the true foundation of Gulfstream Holdings. He was a problem that needed to be solved. The final weeks of Samuel's life were marked by an increasing sense of isolation. His allies in the community were growing fearful, intimidated by the subtle pressure exerted by Croft's organization. Friends stopped returning his calls. The local newspaper, a beneficiary of Croft's advertising budget, stopped printing his letters. He was a lone voice crying out against a tide of manufactured consent. From his lighthouse, he watched the jetty grow longer each day, a physical manifestation of his impending defeat. But Samuel wasn't a man who knew how to quit. He knew he had the evidence to expose Croft. He just needed to find someone who was willing to listen before it was too late. The stage was set for a final, desperate confrontation. Among the shrimpers and fishermen who initially stood with Samuel, a deep chill had begun to set in. His closest friend, Earl Thibodeau, a man whose hands were as worn and leathery as the nets he cast, began to visit the lighthouse less frequently. When he did come, his eyes were shadowed with a fear Samuel had never seen before. Earl spoke in hushed tones of friendly warnings from Croft's men at the docks, of boat inspections that went on for hours over minor infractions, and of bank loans for new equipment that were suddenly and inexplicably denied. He begged Samuel to back down, to think of Clara. "This isn't a fight you can win, Sam," he'd pleaded, his voice thick with a mix of loyalty and terror. "This man owns this coast now. You're just a lighthouse keeper." But Samuel, steadfast in his conviction, saw this fear as the very reason he had to continue. His fight was for men like Earl, whether they knew it or not. As his allies dwindled, Samuel's logbook became his sole confidant and his most important weapon. The pages, once filled with poetic observations about migrating birds and the color of the sea at sunrise, now took on the cold, hard language of an investigator. He meticulously recorded the serial numbers of the barges delivering sand he knew was dredged from a polluted inlet, unsuitable for structural concrete. He noted the dates and times of specific concrete pours, cross-referencing them with tide charts and weather conditions that would compromise the curing process. He even sketched the patterns of corrosion on the cheaper rebar he saw stockpiled at the construction site. Each entry was a piece of a puzzle, a methodical and damning indictment of a fraud so vast it was being hidden in plain sight, deep beneath the waves of the Gulf. Warren Croft's influence extended far beyond the construction site, weaving itself into the very fabric of the local power structure. He was a master of the soft bribe and the implied threat. A generous donation to the sheriff's re-election campaign ensured that any complaints about his work crews were quietly dismissed. Sponsoring the new high school football scoreboard earned him the public adoration of the mayor. He hosted lavish fishing trips for state regulators, charming them with expensive whiskey and promises of future prosperity. To the outside world, he was a civic leader. But Samuel saw the truth. Croft was building a fortress of influence, brick by brick, ensuring that when the time came, no one in a position of authority would dare to question him. The system wasn't just failing to stop him, it was actively protecting him. For 8-year-old Clara, the world remained one of sunlight on water, and the comforting rhythm of the lighthouse beam sweeping across her bedroom wall at night. She was aware of her father's worry only in the abstract, the way a child senses a shift in the weather. She noticed he spent more time in his study, the door closed, the scratching of his pen more frantic than before. She heard snippets of hushed, tense phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Her father would then turn to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a shadow of an immense burden lingering there. He worked tirelessly to preserve the sanctity of her childhood, to keep his dangerous crusade separate from his love for her, but the two worlds were on an inevitable collision course, and the walls he built between them were beginning to crack. The threats soon escalated from subtle economic pressure to something far more tangible and menacing. One foggy morning, Samuel found the fuel line to his small boat had been cleanly cut, leaving him stranded until a passing fishing vessel towed him back. He reported it to the sheriff's department, but the deputy who took the report barely wrote anything down, dismissing it as likely vandalism by local kids. A week later, one of Croft's foremen, a large man with cold eyes, paid an unsolicited visit to the lighthouse under the guise of checking on a survey marker. The man said little, but his presence was a clear message of intimidation. He lingered, his gaze sweeping over the family photos on the wall, a silent reminder of what Samuel stood to lose. Samuel documented it all in the log, his writing precise, betraying no fear, only a hardening resolve. Samuel's background as a biologist gave him an advantage Croft hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just an emotional environmentalist, he was a scientist. He understood the chemical composition of proper marine-grade concrete and the specific saline content of the sand required to ensure its longevity. He secretly collected samples from the construction site, scraping bits of wet concrete from the pylons and scooping sand from the barges under the cover of darkness. He packaged them carefully and mailed them to a former university colleague in a different state, asking for an independent analysis. He knew that proving Croft was committing fraud, endangering future shipping and the coastline itself with a deliberately weakened structure, was a far more powerful weapon than simply arguing about the fate of the local shrimp population. He was gathering the kind of evidence that could lead to federal charges. Within the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office, the unspoken rule was clear. Warren Croft was off-limits. He was a benefactor, a job creator, a friend to the powerful. Any junior officer with ambitions of a long career knew not to look too closely at Gulfstream Holdings' operations. Detective Miller, then a young, sharp investigator, had heard the whispers from shrimpers and seen the shoddy workmanship firsthand. He had flagged a few incident reports related to the project, noting a pattern of intimidation and suspicious, quote, accidents. But each time, his inquiries were quietly redirected by his superiors. He was advised to focus on real police work, a clear signal to drop any line of investigation that might lead back to Croft. The corruption wasn't just overt, it was systemic, a silent, corrosive force that ensured justice was a commodity, not a right. In the first week of October 1994, a sense of finality settled over Samuel Vance. The Gulfstream jetty was nearly complete, a long, gray scar stretching out into the sea. He felt time slipping away. His attempts to contact state environmental agencies had been met with bureaucratic silence, his letters and evidence packets lost in a system designed to ignore inconvenient truths. He was utterly alone, armed with a logbook filled with explosive secrets but with no one willing to light the fuse. He knew Croft was aware of his investigation. The escalating threats were proof of that. A final confrontation felt inevitable. He made one last, desperate entry in his log, detailing a plan to meet with a journalist from New Orleans. It was a risky, last-ditch effort, a final move in a deadly game he was about to lose. Back in her quiet New Orleans apartment, the world outside faded into a muted hum. The only thing that felt real was the solid, heavy presence of the logbook on her coffee table. For 2 decades, her father's memory had been a fragile thing, a collection of faded photographs and the hollow ache of unanswered questions. Now his voice was here, tangible, bound in leather and preserved by the very monument built to silence him. The grief was still a raw, open wound, but a new feeling was crystallizing within it, a cold, hard resolve. She was an architect, a builder. She understood foundations. And she knew, with an instinct she inherited from her father, that she was about to dedicate her life to dismantling one, piece by corrupt piece. But she couldn't do it alone. This wasn't a fight for an architect. It was a fight for a warrior, and she needed to find one. Her search led her to a name whispered in circles of power with a mixture of fear and respect. Maya Singh. Maya was an investigative journalist for a fiercely independent digital news outlet, a woman who had built her career on toppling giants. She specialized in the kind of slow, methodical deep dives that exposed the rot beneath the polished veneer of corporate philanthropy and political promises. Clara spent a night reading her work, articles that unraveled complex financial fraud and exposed systemic corruption with the precision of a surgeon. With trembling fingers, she composed a brief, cryptic email. "My name is Clara Vance. My father was Samuel Vance. A hurricane just returned his voice after 20 years of silence. And it has a story to tell about the Gulfstream jetty and Warren Croft." She hit send, her heart pounding, hoping the name would be enough to cut through the noise of a busy journalist's inbox. They met 2 days later in a nondescript coffee shop in the Garden District, the air thick with the smell of roasted chicory. Clara arrived first, the waterproof satchel feeling like a lead weight in her lap. Maya Singh entered precisely on time, her movements efficient, her gaze direct and analytical. She carried an air of professional skepticism, the armor of a journalist who had heard 1,000 sensational claims that led nowhere. Without much preamble, Clara placed the satchel on the small table between them. She recounted the impossible story of the hurricane, the shattered pylon, and the discovery. Maya listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. But when Clara finally unsealed the bag and slid the perfectly preserved logbook across the table, she saw a flicker in the journalist's eyes. It was the spark of pure, unadulterated curiosity. This wasn't just a story. It was a relic. "Before we go any further," Maya said, her voice even but firm, "we have to prove this is real. Every word, every page has to be unassailable." For Clara, this meant a pilgrimage to her mother's attic, a space she hadn't entered in years. There, in a cedar chest, was a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. Letters her father had written to her mother during their courtship, filled with observations about the sea and declarations of love in his distinctive, steady hand. Back in her apartment, she laid them out beside the open logbook. The slope of the G's, the sharp cross of the T's, the elegant loop of the S, in his signature. It was him. The handwriting was a perfect heartbreaking match. Each stroke of the pen on the page was a fresh wave of grief and love, a confirmation that the man who wrote these words was the same man she had lost. Maya, however, needed more than sentimental confirmation. She needed science. She sent high-resolution scans of several pages to a forensic document examiner she trusted, a man who had testified in federal cases. The report came back 48 hours later, a dry clinical document that made Clara's heart sing. Report FDE 2014-117. The analysis of the paper fibers and binding glue was consistent with materials used by the specific stationer in the early 1990s. The ink was a standard iron gall formula, exhibiting oxidation patterns consistent with 20 years of natural aging in a stable, low-oxygen environment. The examiner concluded with a 99.8% probability that the entries were authentic to the period and written by a single hand over a continuous time frame. The logbook wasn't just a diary, it was now Exhibit A, a voice from the grave, certified by science. With the book's authenticity established, their apartment became an investigative headquarters. Maya worked with a methodical intensity, plastering a wall with a timeline, cross-referencing Samuel's entries with archived news reports, shipping manifests, and local government meeting minutes from 1994. The early pages painted a vivid picture of the man Clara barely remembered. He wrote about the ecological balance of the wetlands with a scientist's precision and a poet's soul. "He wasn't just a protester," Maya observed, tapping a finger on an entry detailing the spawning habits of speckled trout. "He was a witness. He was building a factual record of what was being lost. That makes him credible. That makes him dangerous." For Clara, every word was a gift, a piece of her father returned to her, filling in the faded outlines of her memory with vibrant color. They continued reading, page by page, the tone shifting from ecological lament to a tense chronicle of a corporate siege. Then they found it. The entry for October 10, 1994, just 2 days before he disappeared. The handwriting was slightly more hurried, the pressure of the pen heavier on the page. Clara read the words aloud, her voice catching in her throat. "Croft was here, at the Lighthouse. Offered $50,000 to look the other way. A consulting fee, he called it." The figure was staggering. In 1994, it was more than 5 times her father's annual salary. It was a bribe designed to be irresistible. The fact that he refused it, that he chose his principles over a fortune, filled Clara with a fierce, painful pride. Her father hadn't just been a victim. He had been a hero, standing his ground against a corrupt and powerful man. The entry didn't end there. The final sentences were a death warrant, scrawled in black ink. "He gave me an ultimatum," Clara read, the words sending a chill down her spine despite the humid New Orleans air. "He knows I have proof of the faulty materials. If I don't shut up, he'll shut me up." It was all there, the motive, the threat, the chilling premeditation. The single entry transformed the official narrative of a tragic boating accident into a near-certain case of cold-blooded murder. Warren Croft, the celebrated philanthropist and captain of industry, was now the prime suspect. The logbook had given them the why. But Maya's gaze was fixed on a different part of the sentence. "Proof of the faulty materials," she repeated, her mind already racing. "Your father had evidence. Physical evidence. What was it, and where could it possibly be now?" The question hung in the air of Clara's apartment, a stark, practical challenge in a room thick with ghosts and grief. "Physical evidence," Maya had said. For Clara, the logbook was everything, the emotional core of her father's last days. But as she reread the entries, she saw him through new eyes, not just as a father or an activist, but as a methodical scientist. He wasn't just observing, he was collecting, analyzing, and documenting. He wrote about the specific gravity of the sand, the telltale signs of excessive salinity in the water after a pour, the premature rust he saw on the stockpiled rebar. This wasn't just a diary of a man under siege, it was the field journal of a researcher conducting his final, fatal experiment. The realization was a strange comfort, a new layer of connection to the man she barely knew. He was a man of facts, and he had left them a trail of facts to follow. Maya, ever the pragmatist, zeroed in on the most actionable details. "He didn't just see things, he recorded them like a chain of custody," she explained, her finger tracing a line of Samuel's precise script. They found what they were looking for in a series of entries from late September 1994. Under the cover of darkness, Samuel had taken his small boat out to the construction site. He had documented the serial numbers of the barges, GSH 113** and times GSH 117**, and the exact times they offloaded their cargo of sand. He described scooping samples into sealed glass jars, labeling them with the date, time, and location. He was building a case with tangible, testable proof. For the first time, Clara and Maya had more than just her father's words. They had a specific, verifiable lead that could be traced back into the real world, a thread that might unravel Croft's entire empire. Reading the description of these clandestine trips triggered a phantom memory for Clara. A faint, dreamlike image surfaced from the depths of her 8-year-old mind. The sound of her father's boat docking long after dark, a sound that was unusual enough to stir her from sleep. She remembered peering from her bedroom window in the lighthouse and seeing him on the dock below, his silhouette moving wearily in the moonlight. He was covered in something dark, mud or grime, and he moved with a quiet, urgent tension she had never seen before. At the time, her sleepy mind had registered it as a late night of fishing. Now, 20 years later, the memory was recast in a chilling new light. He hadn't been fishing for trout. He had been risking his life alone in the dark to gather the truth that had ultimately cost him everything. While Clara was lost in the past, Maya was already working the phones, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Her investigative instincts were razor sharp. She explained that Gulfstream Holdings would have used a web of subcontractors and shell companies to obscure their supply chain. The barge numbers were their key. After hours of digging through digitized maritime archives and old corporate filings, she got a hit. The company that owned times GSH 113* and times GSH 117* had been dissolved in 1998, but for a brief period, it was a subsidiary of a larger logistics firm. Maya found a contact, an old shipping clerk who owed her a favor, and within an hour, a grainy, scanned copy of a 1994 shipping manifest appeared in her inbox. The document was dry and bureaucratic, but its contents were explosive. It confirmed that on the exact dates Samuel had recorded, Those barges had been loaded with sand from a polluted, blacklisted inlet, a source known for its corrosive, high-silt content, completely illegal for use in marine construction. Clara stared at the manifest on Maya's laptop screen. It was the first piece of external, independent evidence that corroborated her father's logbook. The cold, typed words on the screen: source, Black Bay Inlet. Destination, Gulf Stream Jetty Site C**, made her father's claims terrifyingly real. Suddenly, the jetty wasn't just a symbol of her personal loss. It was a public menace. A structure built with poisoned sand and cheap steel, a monument to greed that was likely a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. The very storm that had revealed her father's secret had been a warning of the structure's inherent weakness. A wave of cold dread washed over her. This was bigger than her family's tragedy. This was about public safety, about a fraud that endangered thousands of lives and an entire coastal economy, all to line Warren Croft's pockets. Her father hadn't just died to protect the wetlands. He had died trying to prevent a disaster. "This is incredible," Maya breathed, her journalistic excitement palpable. "We have proof of the motive. We have the threat. And now we have independent corroboration of the underlying crime, the fraud." But her expression quickly turned serious as she pointed out the enormous obstacle ahead. "The problem is, our proof is buried under 100,000 tons of concrete at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. Croft will just deny it, and we have no way of physically proving what's inside that jetty today." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of that impossibility sank in. They had the story, but not the irrefutable evidence. Then, as Maya scanned the logbook one more time, her eyes widened. "Wait a minute," she whispered, pointing to a small, almost overlooked notation at the bottom of a page from October 5th. Samples mailed to Dr. Eris Thorne, Tulane, Univ, Department of Geology, for independent analysis. The name Eris Thorne landed in the room like a flare in the dark, a surge of adrenaline and hope, so potent it almost made Clara dizzy, shot through her. Her father hadn't just collected the evidence. He had secured it. He had sent it to an expert, a third party, a man of science who could validate his findings. The image of those labeled glass jars, filled with sand and bits of concrete, no longer seemed like a lost cause. They might still exist, tucked away in a dusty university storage room, a forgotten box containing the scientific proof that could bring down Warren Croft. This was the missing link. It wasn't just a he-said-she-said story anymore. If they could find those samples, they could prove, with modern scientific certainty, that her father was telling the truth. It was a chance not just for justice, but for total vindication of the man he was. Maya was already typing furiously, her skepticism replaced by the thrill of the chase. The hope was fragile, a 20-year-old long shot, but it was real. A few clicks brought up the Tulane University faculty archives. Dr. Eris Thorne, a respected marine geologist, had retired in 2003. He was now a professor emeritus. Another search pulled up a current address and phone number. He was alive, living in a retirement community in Naples, Florida. He was 82 years old. The entire case, the culmination of her father's fight and her own quest for truth, now hinged on this one fragile variable. Would an elderly man, 2 decades removed from his career, remember receiving a small, unsolicited package from a Louisiana lighthouse keeper? And if he did, in some miracle of memory and meticulous record-keeping, could he possibly know where that evidence was today? Their path was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. They had to get to Florida. The flight to Naples, Florida was a pressurized tube of suspended hope and suffocating anxiety. Clara stared out the small oval window, watching the patchwork of Louisiana wetlands give way to the deep, indifferent blue of the Gulf of Mexico. Below them was the very water that had claimed her father, the same water that had, in a fit of violent irony, returned his voice. Beside her, Maya Singh was a portrait of focused intensity, her laptop open, her fingers clicking away as she reviewed archived geological survey maps of the Louisiana coast from the 1990s. They were chasing a ghost, a memory, a 20-year-old package sent to an academic who was now in his 80s. It was a thread so thin it felt like it could snap at any moment. Every mile they traveled south felt like a step deeper into the past, a pilgrimage to a stranger who might hold the key not just to justice, but to the very truth of who her father was in his final, desperate days. The retirement community was an oasis of curated tranquility, a world of manicured lawns, serene water features, and the quiet hum of electric golf carts. It felt a million miles away from the raw, untamed beauty of the Pointe-aux-Fer reef. The air was perfumed with hibiscus instead of salt and decay. As they walked down a pristine corridor toward Dr. Thorne's apartment, Clara felt a profound sense of displacement. Their quest, born of a hurricane's fury and a father's buried secrets, felt alien in this place of peaceful finality. When they stood before his door, numbered 214, Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The entire weight of their investigation, the logbook, her father's legacy, all of it, rested on what lay behind this single door. A polite, elderly man could answer, and, with a simple, "I'm sorry, I don't recall," their journey could come to a dead, silent end. Dr. Eris Thorne was a small man with surprisingly sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He greeted them with a polite but reserved curiosity, ushering them into an apartment filled with books on geology and framed photographs of dramatic rock formations. Maya, with practiced efficiency, laid out the story, starting with the hurricane and ending with the logbook, which she placed gently on the coffee table between them. Thorne listened, his hands steepled, his expression a mask of academic neutrality. When Maya mentioned Samuel Vance's name, he gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "I'm afraid that name doesn't ring a bell," he said, his voice raspy with age. A cold dread began to seep into Clara's heart. The thread had snapped. They had come all this way, chasing a phantom, only to find the trail had gone cold 2 decades ago in a university mailroom. The moment shifted when Maya, undeterred, opened the logbook to the entry from October 5, 1994, and pointed to the notation. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses, and squinted at Samuel's handwriting. He read the words aloud, softly. "Samples mailed to Dr. Eris Thorne, Tulane Univ Department of Geology." A long silence followed. Then, a slow spark of recognition flickered in his eyes. "The lighthouse keeper," he murmured, looking up at them. He explained that the name itself was lost to time, but he vividly remembered receiving an unsolicited package containing meticulously labeled samples of sand and concrete. He had been fascinated by the accompanying letter, written by a layman with the observational precision of a trained scientist. He remembered the man's urgent plea for an independent analysis, a plea from a voice crying out from a remote stretch of the coast, a voice he now realized had been silenced shortly after. Thorne's memory, once jogged, returned with stunning clarity. He confirmed that he had indeed performed a preliminary analysis of the samples back in 1994. The results, he said, had been deeply disturbing. The sand was full of organic contaminants and had a dangerously high silt content, which he knew would prevent the concrete from curing properly and would promote catastrophic corrosion of the rebar within. The concrete sample itself was brittle, showing signs of an improper water-to-cement ratio. He described trying to call the lighthouse several times to warn the sender of the grave public safety risk his findings implied. No one ever answered. A short time later, he read a small article in the paper about a lighthouse keeper lost at sea during a squall and felt a chilling certainty that it was no accident. With no one to report to and no proof of a crime, he had filed his notes away, a troubling footnote in a long career. But what about the samples themselves? Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. Do you have any idea what might have happened to them? Dr. Thorne gave a faint, wry smile. Young lady, a geologist never throws away a good rock, he said. He explained that upon his retirement from Tulane in 2003, he had his entire academic life, every research paper, every field note, every catalog sample, packed into dozens of boxes and shipped to a climate-controlled storage unit not 5 miles from where they were sitting. He hadn't laid eyes on the material in over a decade, but he was a man of systems and labels. He was certain that somewhere in that unit, in a box marked with the correct date range, the physical evidence her father had died to protect was still waiting, perfectly preserved. In that moment, the impossible felt tangible. The truth wasn't lost. It had just been in storage. The storage facility was a place of anonymous, numbered doors, each hiding away a piece of a life. Thorne unlocked Unit 34B, and the metal door rolled up with a groan, revealing a tightly packed archive of a geologist's mind. Cardboard boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling, their sides covered in Thorne's neat, academic script. For a tense hour, they carefully shifted boxes, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Finally, tucked away in a back corner, they found it. A box labeled MISC. Field Samples, 1992 to 1995. With trembling hands, Clara lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton batting, were 2 small glass jars filled with sand and silt, their faded labels bearing her father's unmistakable handwriting. Beside them sat a small, gray, misshapen block of concrete. It was real. After 20 years of darkness, her father's proof was finally in the light. Back in New Orleans, the samples became the heart of a new, scientific assault on Warren Croft's empire. Maya commissioned a full forensic workup from a leading materials engineering firm. The report that came back was a bombshell, a clinical and devastating indictment. It confirmed that the concrete had a compressive strength of less than 500 pounds per square inch, dangerously below the 4,000 psi specified in the state contract for marine structures. The chemical analysis of the sand revealed not just silt and clay, but traces of industrial pollutants known to aggressively accelerate rebar corrosion. The engineers concluded that the jetty was not just poorly constructed, but was a ticking time bomb, a catastrophic structural failure waiting for the right storm to trigger it. Samuel Vance hadn't just been murdered to cover up financial fraud. He'd been silenced to hide a reckless endangerment of the entire Louisiana coastline. As Maya began to weave this new, explosive evidence into her story, the beast they were poking began to stir. Warren Croft, now a celebrated philanthropist with deep political ties, received a discreet call from an old friend at the state permitting office. A journalist was digging into Gulfstream Holdings, files from the early 90s, specifically the Gulfstream Jetty project. The warning was subtle, but the message was clear. Days later, Clara returned home to find her apartment door unlocked, the deadbolt cleanly jimmied. Nothing was taken, but every drawer was open, every book pulled from its shelf. It was a violation, a calculated act of intimidation, designed to show her that they could reach her any time, anywhere. The fight was no longer about the past. Croft was not a ghost. He was a clear and present danger, and he was watching her every move. The break-in only fueled Maya's determination. She started digging into Croft's business history, following the trail of shell corporations and subcontractors that her father had first identified. A clear and damning pattern emerged. The same company that had supplied the poisoned sand for the Gulfstream jetty had been used on at least 4 other major public works projects across the Gulf Coast. Furthermore, she uncovered a web of political donations, tracing millions of dollars from Croft's foundations to the campaigns of key regulators and politicians who had overseen those very contracts. Samuel Vance's death, she realized, was the cornerstone of this criminal enterprise. Silencing him wasn't just about protecting one project. It was the act that allowed a corrupt empire to flourish for 2 decades, built on a foundation of fraud, bribery, and, she now suspected, more than one silenced voice. Just as the pressure from Croft intensified, a new, unexpected ally emerged from the shadows. Retired Detective Frank Miller, the officer who had handled her father's original case, reached out to Maya through an encrypted messaging app. He told her the story of the logbook's discovery had shaken loose a guilt he'd carried for 20 years. He confessed that the 1994 investigation had been a sham from the start. His superiors, including the then-sheriff who was a known associate of Croft, had ordered him to close the case as a boating accident, ignoring clear signs of foul play. He then revealed the most explosive detail of all, something documented only in his private notes. On the night Samuel vanished, the sheriff's department received an anonymous tip about an unlit boat moored near the jetty construction site. The dispatcher logged the call, but the sheriff himself personally ordered that no patrol car be sent to investigate. Miller knew who had buried the truth, and he was finally ready to testify. Detective Miller's confession landed like a depth charge, sending shockwaves through the entire investigation. It was no longer a story about a lone activist against a corrupt developer. It was now a conspiracy that implicated the very institution sworn to protect the public. In a secure, encrypted video call, Miller, a man with a face etched by 2 decades of regret, laid out the rot at the core of the 1994 investigation. He wasn't just a source, he was a participant, a man who had been forced to bury the truth and had lived with the ghost of that decision every day since. For Clara, hearing him speak was both horrifying and validating. Her father hadn't been failed by a flawed system. He had been deliberately sacrificed by a compromised one. The enemy wasn't just Warren Croft. It was his entire network, and they had worn badges. Miller painted a vivid picture of the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office in 1994, describing an atmosphere where Warren Croft's name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. The sheriff at the time, Jed Landry, was a frequent guest on Croft's yacht and a vocal supporter of the Jetty project. Miller recalled how Landry had personally intervened when he started looking into the threats against Samuel, pulling him aside and warning him to stop chasing shadows. Landry had dismissed Samuel's concerns as the ramblings of an anti-progress fanatic and made it explicitly clear that Gulfstream Holdings was to be considered a community partner, not a subject of investigation. It was a clear top-down directive. Warren Croft was untouchable. The official investigation into Samuel Vance's disappearance was designed to fail before it even began, a piece of theater to placate the public. The most damning revelation was Miller's account of the anonymous tip on the night Samuel vanished. He had been on duty and saw the dispatcher's note about a call from a shrimper reporting an unlit boat near the construction site. The caller mentioned a loud, angry argument between 2 men, followed by a distinct splash. Before a patrol car could be dispatched, Sheriff Landry himself walked into the radio room, took the note, and declared the call was likely a prank. Miller watched, powerless, as his boss ripped the note from the log and threw it in the trash, effectively erasing the only potential witness to Samuel Vance's final moments. This single act of obstruction was the linchpin of the entire cover-up, a deliberate and calculated move to ensure the crime scene would never be investigated, and the truth would sink to the bottom of the Gulf. Maya Singh immediately grasped the terrifying modern-day implications of Miller's testimony. Jed Landry had retired a decade ago, but he had hand-picked his successor, who in turn had promoted his own loyalists. The corruption wasn't a relic of the past. It was an entrenched dynasty. The current sheriff owed his career to the man who had covered up her father's murder. This meant they couldn't simply walk into the sheriff's office with their evidence. To do so would be like delivering a lamb to a pack of wolves. They were completely on their own, operating behind enemy lines in a parish where the lines between law enforcement and a criminal enterprise had been blurred for over 20 years. The risk had escalated exponentially. Their investigation was now an active threat to a deeply rooted power structure that would do anything to protect itself. The knowledge that the local police were compromised cast the break-in at Clara's apartment in a much more sinister light. It wasn't just a scare tactic from a corporate bully. It was a professional message delivered with the confidence of an organization that did not fear repercussions. They could get to her whenever they wanted. A profound sense of vulnerability washed over her, the feeling of being hunted in her own city. Every passing car seemed to hold watching eyes, every unknown number on her phone a potential threat. The fight for her father's legacy was no longer an abstract quest for justice. It was a real, tangible battle for her own safety, waged against a shadowy network that had already proven it was capable of murder and had 2 decades of experience in making problems disappear without a trace. Armed with the name Jed Landry, Maya unleashed her full investigative arsenal. She dove into public records, property deeds, and old campaign finance reports. It didn't take long to find the smoking gun. In late 1995, less than a year after Samuel's case was officially closed, Jed Landry and his wife purchased 200 acres of prime waterfront property. The price they paid was suspiciously low, a fraction of its market value. The seller was a newly formed LLC named Bayou Development Group. It took Maya another day of following a convoluted paper trail through 3 states, but she finally found the connection. The sole registered agent of Bayou Development Group was Warren Croft's personal attorney. It was a blatant, barely disguised bribe, a reward for services rendered, paid out once the coast was clear. The Landry payoff was just the beginning. Maya started cross-referencing every major Gulfstream Holdings project from the past 20 years with the names of the public officials who had approved them. The pattern was sickeningly consistent. A state senator who fast-tracked an environmental waiver for a Croft development later had his son's exorbitant college tuition paid by a, quote, philanthropic grant from a Croft-owned foundation. A county commissioner who rezoned protected wetlands for a luxury resort project suddenly became the silent partner in a lucrative real estate venture financed by a subsidiary of Gulfstream. Samuel Vance hadn't just stumbled upon a single act of fraud. He had threatened to expose the foundational business model of a criminal empire. His murder wasn't an anomaly. It was the cornerstone that allowed Croft to build his fortune on a bedrock of systemic corruption. The news of their investigation, spreading through the coastal grapevine, finally broke a 20-year wall of silence. Earl Thibodeau, the old shrimper, his face a roadmap of hard years and fear, showed up unannounced at Maya's office. With tears in his eyes, he confessed that he was the one who made the anonymous call to the sheriff that night in 1994. He told them he had been setting his crab traps near the jetty when he saw the unlit boat. He recognized Samuel's small skiff and another, larger vessel. He saw 2 figures arguing, their voices carrying across the water. One was Samuel. The other, illuminated for a moment by a passing freighter, was unmistakably Warren Croft. He heard the final, desperate shout, then the splash. He had been paralyzed by fear then, and that fear had haunted him ever since. Earl's confession was a torrent of pent-up guilt. He described how, the day after Samuel disappeared, 2 of Croft's burliest foremen paid him a friendly visit at the docks. They didn't mention Samuel. They just talked about Earl's family, his boat loan, and how treacherous the Gulf could be for a man working alone. The message was unambiguous. His silence was not a choice. It was a survival instinct. For Clara, listening to Earl's trembling voice was like feeling the final, missing piece of her father's story click into place. It was no longer a theory or a collection of clues in a logbook. This was a human being, a friend of her father, bearing witness to the brutal reality of his murder and the suffocating fear that had allowed his killer to walk free for 2 decades. With Earl's eyewitness account and Miller's confirmation of the official cover-up, the narrative was finally complete. Maya now had an irrefutable story, a 3-legged stool of evidence that could not be knocked over. She had her father's own words from the logbook detailing the motive and the threat. She had the physical proof from Dr. Thorne's lab and the forensic engineering report, confirming the massive scale of the public fraud. And now she had the human testimony, an eyewitness to the crime and an insider to the conspiracy that had buried it. The story was no longer just about Warren Croft. It was about the systemic corruption that had enabled him, poisoning an entire region and holding a community captive through fear and influence, all built on the secret buried with Samuel Vance. As Maya prepared to publish her explosive exposé, Croft made his final, desperate move. The subtlety was gone. replaced by the brute force of a cornered animal. A team of lawyers from one of the most ruthless firms in the country served Maya with a preemptive cease and desist order, threatening a $50 million defamation lawsuit. The intimidation was designed to cripple her independent news outlet before the story ever saw the light of day. That same evening, Clara arrived home to find a package on her doorstep. Inside, there was no note, only the body of a dead brown pelican, its neck broken. It was her father's favorite bird, one he had written about with loving detail in the logbook. The message was intimate, cruel, and perfectly clear. We know who you are. We know what you love. Stop now, or we will take everything from you, just as we did from him. The dead pelican lay in the box like a grotesque effigy, its slender neck snapped at an unnatural angle. The feathers, once sleek and iridescent, were dull and matted. Clara stared at it. The smell of the sea and death filling her small apartment, a scent that was a cruel parody of her father's world. This wasn't a corporate threat delivered by a lawyer. This was a language of the swamp, a visceral, personal message of violence. It was Croft reaching across 20 years, not with money or influence, but with the same brutal intimacy he must have used on her father. In that moment, the fight ceased to be about justice for the past. It became a desperate battle for survival in the present. The fear was a cold, physical thing, a knot of ice in her stomach, but beneath it, a different kind of fire was kindled. They hadn't just threatened her, they had desecrated a memory, and in doing so, they had erased her last shred of hesitation. Maya saw the look in Clara's eyes and knew they had crossed a threshold. The time for careful planning and methodical evidence gathering was over. Croft had escalated the conflict to its most primitive form, and the only possible response was to detonate the bomb they had so carefully constructed. "He thinks this will make us run," Maya said, her voice a low, steady hum of controlled fury as she gently closed the lid on the box. "He's wrong. This is what proves we're right. This is the act of a guilty, desperate man. We publish everything, right now." There was no debate, no weighing of pros and cons. The dead bird was the final piece of evidence, a confirmation of the monster they were facing. They would not be silenced. They would become a hurricane of their own, tearing away the foundations of Croft's world, just as Isaac had torn apart the jetty. The decision was made in the heavy, charged silence of the room. They sat side by side in the glow of Maya's laptop, the finished expose a weapon waiting to be fired. The screen was filled with the faces of the past, a smiling Samuel Vance, a young, ambitious Warren Croft, a weary Earl Thibodeau. The article was a meticulous tapestry of evidence, weaving together the logbook's poignant entries, the cold, hard data of the forensic reports, and the damning testimony of Miller and Earl. With a final, shared look of grim resolve, Maya's finger hovered over the mouse. The click was almost silent, a tiny sound that unleashed a digital tidal wave. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, the first notification pinged. Then another, and another. A cascade of alerts, shares, and comments began to flood in, the story spreading like wildfire through the invisible arteries of the Internet, carrying Samuel Vance's voice from its concrete tomb to the entire world in a matter of seconds. The initial reaction was a shockwave of digital outrage. On screens across Louisiana and then the nation, the headline blazed, "The Jetty's Secret, a 20-year tale of corruption, fraud, and murder." Maya's news outlet, once a niche purveyor of independent journalism, saw its servers strain under the unprecedented traffic. The story was everywhere. Major news networks broke into their regular programming to report on the allegations. The name Warren Croft, once synonymous with philanthropy and progress, was now inextricably linked with the words, "murder suspect." The logbook pages, scanned in high resolution, became viral artifacts, Samuel's steady handwriting a ghostly testament against the man who had silenced him. The public was not just reading a story. They were seeing the proof, a 20-year-old crime laid bare for their judgment. The fortress of reputation Croft had spent a lifetime building was being dismantled, tweet by tweet, share by share. Miles away, in his glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city, Warren Croft watched the empire of his own making burn. He saw his face on the television screen, juxtaposed with a grainy photo of Samuel Vance. He saw the scanned pages of the logbook, the words he thought were buried forever, now glowing with accusatory light. The carefully maintained mask of the benevolent patriarch shattered, replaced by the raw fury of a cornered predator. He swept a crystal glass from his desk, its shattering echo a pathetic counterpoint to the storm of public opinion raging outside. For 2 decades he had been the master of his universe, a man who could buy silence, bury truth, and bend the world to his will. Now he was powerless, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the ghost of a simple lighthouse keeper and the relentless, echoing voice of a book he thought he had entombed forever. The public dissection of his crimes was brutal and swift. Maya's article included interactive graphics that made the complex fraud easy to understand. Users could click on a timeline to see the flow of money from Gulfstream Holdings to former Sheriff Jed Landry's Shell Corporation. They could view a 3D model of the jetty, showing the compromised pylons built with poisoned sand. They could hear an audio clip of Earl Thibodeau's trembling voice describing the argument he witnessed on the water that night. The story wasn't just an accusation. It was a comprehensive, multimedia indictment. Every denial issued by Croft's high-priced legal team was immediately drowned out by a fresh wave of evidence presented in the court of public opinion. He had buried a man, but he couldn't bury the data, the science, and the human testimony that now held him accountable. The institutional dominoes began to fall. The Louisiana governor, a longtime recipient of Croft's political donations, was forced to hold a press conference, his face a grim mask, as he promised a full and impartial investigation by the state attorney general's office. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers immediately announced an emergency structural review of the Gulfstream jetty and every other public works project built by Croft's company. Even more ominously for Croft, the FBI's New Orleans field office released a terse one-sentence statement. "We are aware of the allegations and are monitoring the situation." The system that had protected him for so long, greased by his money and influence, was now turning on him, its gears grinding inexorably toward a reckoning he could no longer control. The walls were closing in, built from the very secrets he had killed to protect. In the small coastal town where Samuel had made his last stand, the story landed like a cleansing fire. The suffocating fear that had held the community in its grip for 20 years finally broke. Fishermen and shrimpers gathered at the docks, speaking Samuel Vance's name with a reverence that had long been relegated to hushed whispers. Earl Thibodeau, who had lived for 2 decades as a haunted man, was now surrounded by neighbors clapping him on the back, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. They saw the article not as news, but as liberation. It was the truth they had always known in their bones, but had been too afraid to speak aloud. Samuel Vance was no longer the man who disappeared. He was the hero who had been right all along, a martyr whose sacrifice had finally been given meaning. Amidst the chaos, Clara felt a strange, quiet pull. She needed to see him, not to scream or to accuse, but to bear witness to the end of his reign. That evening, Warren Croft was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at a major charity gala, an event that was supposed to celebrate his latest multi-million-dollar donation to the city's art museum. It was a commitment he couldn't break without signaling his guilt. Clara put on a simple black dress, the logbook's satchel clutched in her hand like a sacred text, and drove to the museum. She moved through the opulent ballroom, a ghost from the past walking among the city's elite, who were now whispering and glancing at their phones. The festive atmosphere curdled by the scandal that had consumed their patron. She found a place at the back of the room, a silent observer waiting for the final act. When Warren Croft took the stage, he was a diminished figure. The charismatic smile was a strained, hollow grimace. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a stiff wooden posture. He gripped the lectern, his knuckles white, and began to read his prepared remarks, his voice a pale imitation of its usual commanding tone. The room was filled with the quiet rustle of discomfort. Then his eyes scanned the crowd and found hers. Across the expanse of crystalline silk, their gazes locked. For a fleeting, terrible moment, the ballroom, the city, the 20 years that separated them all fell away. There was only the killer and the daughter of the man he had killed. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, a living embodiment of the truth he could no longer escape. In her steady gaze, he saw not hatred, but something far more devastating: resolution. He saw the unyielding integrity of her father, a legacy that had outlasted concrete and corruption. He saw the face of Samuel Vance, a man he had dismissed as an insignificant obstacle, now resurrected in the quiet strength of his child. The carefully constructed artifice of his life crumbled in that silent, searing exchange. He stumbled over a word, his voice catching in his throat. The teleprompter scrolled on, but he could no longer see the words. The mask of the philanthropist, the captain of industry, the city father, fell away, revealing the small, panicked fraud beneath. He was exposed, not by a prosecutor or a judge, but by the unwavering eyes of the daughter whose life he had shattered. He couldn't go on. He just stood there, speechless, as the weight of his sins finally, publicly, crushed him. Later that night, as the news cycle reached a fever pitch with reports of Croft's public breakdown, Maya received one final, encrypted message from Detective Miller. "There's one more thing," it read. "The last page. The one you held back." He attached a scan of the final frantic entry in the logbook, written on the very day Samuel disappeared. It wasn't a philosophical reflection or a summary of evidence. It was a direct transcription of a threat, a record of his killer's final words to him. "Croft found me on the water." Samuel had written, his script jagged and rushed. He said, "The gulf is deep enough to hold a lighthouse keeper and all his secrets." He smiled when he said it. This was it. The intimate, chilling detail that transformed the case from a collection of circumstantial evidence into the final, damning testimony of a murdered man, speaking his killer's name from beyond the grave. Clara stood on the museum steps, the cool night air a balm on her skin. She didn't feel the elation of victory or the satisfaction of revenge. Instead, a deep, quiet sense of peace settled over her, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing for 20 years. Her father's name was cleared. His fight had been vindicated. His voice, carried by a hurricane and amplified by their courage, had finally broken through the silence. The legal battles would come, a long and messy aftermath, but the true war was over. The truth was out. She looked up at the vast, dark sky, the same sky her father had watched from his lighthouse, and for the first time since she was 8 years old, she felt he wasn't lost. He was finally home. The light he had so faithfully tended was no longer needed to guide ships. It was now a beacon, illuminating a path to a justice that had, against all odds, finally arrived. Warren Croft's silent, public collapse at the charity gala was the end of an era. Before he could be escorted from the stage by his panicked handlers, plainclothes officers from the state attorney general's office were already moving through the stunned crowd. The final page of the logbook, published by Maya Singh in a strategic update to her article just moments after Croft took the stage, had provided what prosecutors needed: a direct, first-hand account of a death threat. Croft was arrested in a quiet back room of the museum, away from the cameras, the flash of handcuffs on his wrists, a stark contrast to the glittering opulence of his life. The charge was not just obstruction or fraud, it was murder. The words Samuel Vance had frantically scribbled 20 years prior, "The gulf is deep enough to hold a lighthouse keeper and all his secrets," were now echoing in every newsroom and courtroom in the state, a dead man's testimony finally delivered. The case against Warren Croft was not a simple murder trial, it was the dismantling of a criminal enterprise. The Attorney General, leveraging the evidence Maya and Clara had unearthed, built a massive racketeering RICO case against Gulfstream Holdings. The charges were a testament to the scale of the deception: wire fraud, mail fraud, bribery of public officials, witness intimidation, and, at the heart of it all, the felony murder of Samuel Vance, a death that occurred during the commission of these other crimes. The prosecution argued that Samuel's murder wasn't a personal dispute, but a calculated business decision, a necessary expenditure to protect a 20-year conspiracy that had generated billions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. The logbook, once a father's private diary, was now the foundational document in one of the largest corporate corruption cases in Louisiana history. The arrests did not stop with Warren Croft. 2 days later, a stooped, indignant Jed Landry was led from his sprawling waterfront estate in handcuffs. The property deeds Maya had uncovered were irrefutable proof of a bribe, payment for his role in burying the initial investigation. The current sheriff, Landry's hand-picked successor, was forced to resign amid a federal investigation into the department's systemic corruption. Detective Miller's testimony blew the case wide open, leading to a full-scale federal takeover of the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office. The rot Samuel Vance had tried to expose was not just in the concrete of the jetty, but in the very foundations of the local justice system, and now, finally, it was being systematically purged, a painful but necessary cleansing fire that swept through the corridors of power. The fate of the Gulfstream jetty itself became a symbol of the entire sordid affair. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, armed with the forensic report commissioned by Maya, conducted an emergency sonar and core drilling analysis. Their findings were even more damning than expected. The structure was a hollow shell of its intended strength, riddled with corroded rebar and crumbling low-grade concrete. They declared it a catastrophic failure in progress, a clear and present danger to shipping, coastal communities, and the environment. The jetty, Croft's proudest achievement, was officially condemned. A slow, painstaking, multi-million-dollar demolition project was initiated, a public admission that Samuel Vance had been right all along. The monument to greed was being unmade, piece by piece, its deconstruction, a public penance for the crime it was built to conceal. Weeks after the arrests, Clara drove the 2 hours back to the coast, not to the sterile sheriff's office, but to the overgrown path that led to the old Point-au-Fer Reef Lighthouse. It had been decommissioned years ago, a skeletal relic against the sky. She walked through the rusted iron door and up the spiraling staircase, her footsteps echoing in the silence. In her father's old study, a fine layer of dust covered everything, but the room was just as she remembered it. She stood by the window where he had stood, looking out at the endless expanse of water and sky. For the first time, she didn't feel the hollow ache of his absence. Instead, she felt his presence, a quiet, steadfast strength in the very air of the place. She had not just found his voice, she had brought it home. The resolution of her father's case fundamentally reshaped Clara's identity. For 2 decades, she had carried the unspoken shame of being the daughter of a man who, according to the whispers, had abandoned his family. She had channeled her grief into the precise, controlled world of architecture, building strong, stable structures as if to compensate for the fractured foundation of her own life. Now, that weight was gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet pride. She was the daughter of Samuel Vance, a hero who chose integrity over wealth, truth over safety. She found that her own professional skills were not a departure from his legacy, but a continuation of it. He had fought to protect the natural world from corrupt construction. She would dedicate her career to building a better, more honest world, ensuring that foundations, both literal and metaphorical, were built to last. In the small fishing community that had once feared Warren Croft, a quiet revolution took place. The fear that had kept them silent for 20 years was replaced by a defiant sense of ownership over their own story. Earl Thibodeau, no longer a man haunted by what he had seen, became an unlikely local celebrity, his eyewitness account a source of communal pride and validation. He spoke openly of his friend Samuel, sharing stories of his courage and conviction with a new generation. In a town hall meeting, the community voted unanimously to rename the newly restored coastal park, the very wetlands Samuel had fought to save. It was now the Samuel Vance Memorial Preserve, a living tribute to the man who had given his life to protect it, ensuring his name would be remembered not for how he died, but for what he lived for. Maya Singh's exposé, The Jetty's Secret, earned her the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Her small, independent news outlet was catapulted onto the national stage, becoming a beacon for deep, uncompromising journalism in an era of fleeting headlines. The story became a case study in journalism schools, a testament to the power of a single, well-sourced story to topple an empire and rewrite history. Maya, however, found her greatest satisfaction not in the awards, but in the quiet partnership she had forged with Clara. They had taken the voice of one forgotten man and made it powerful enough to shake the pillars of a corrupt system. She had not just reported a story, she had helped deliver a justice that had been denied for far too long, reaffirming her belief in the essential, world-changing power of the truth. Retired Detective Frank Miller found his own form of redemption in the cold, formal setting of a grand jury hearing. He took the stand not as a disgraced officer, but as a key witness for the prosecution. With a steady voice, he recounted every detail of the 1994 cover-up, from Sheriff Laundrie's direct orders to the deliberate destruction of Earl Thibodeau's anonymous tip. His testimony was a meticulous confession, an act of professional courage that laid bare the conspiracy from the inside. He knew his career was over, and he faced potential charges for his past inaction, but as he stepped down from the witness stand, he felt a peace that had eluded him for 20 years. He had finally honored the memory of the man whose case he had been forced to abandon, fulfilling a duty that had haunted his conscience for half his life. Warren Croft's trial was a national spectacle, a courtroom drama that laid bare the insidious nature of power and corruption. His defense team, a battalion of the most expensive lawyers money could buy, attempted to paint Samuel Vance as a disgruntled fanatic and Maya Singh as a reckless journalist engaged in a witch hunt. But they could not discredit the logbook, they could not refute the forensic science of the concrete samples, and they could not break the quiet, unshakable testimonies of Earl Thibodeau and Frank Miller. The prosecution methodically presented the evidence, piece by damning piece, until the image of Croft as a civic leader was completely eroded, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. The jury, a panel of ordinary citizens, saw the truth with perfect clarity. The verdict was delivered on a gray, overcast afternoon. Guilty on all counts. The judge, citing the, quote, staggering breadth and chilling callousness of the decades-long criminal enterprise, sentenced Warren Croft to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, a shrunken, defeated old man, his eyes briefly met Clara's. There was no remorse in his gaze, only the cold, empty fury of a king who had lost his kingdom. For Clara, there was no surge of triumph, no satisfying taste of revenge. There was only a profound and final sense of closure. The question that had defined her life, what happened to her father, had been answered. The story was over. Justice, delivered 20 years late, was justice nonetheless. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. The Vance Act was passed by the Louisiana State Legislature, creating new, stringent whistleblower protections for individuals reporting corporate and governmental malfeasance, particularly on public works projects. Every contract ever awarded to Gulfstream Holdings was subjected to a federal review, uncovering a web of similar fraudulent schemes across the country and leading to a cascade of new investigations and reforms. The story of the lighthouse keeper and his logbook became a cautionary tale, a powerful reminder that no secret is buried forever, and that the truth, no matter how deep it is hidden, can sometimes find its way to the surface, carried on the winds of a storm. 1 year later, Clara stood on the shore, watching a massive barge slowly haul away the last remnants of the Gulfstream jetty. The concrete monster that had swallowed her father's life and secrets was finally gone. In its place was just the open water, the horizon clear and unbroken. She opened the satchel and took out the logbook one last time, its leather cover worn smooth by her touch. She didn't need to read it anymore. Its words were written on her heart. Her father's voice was no longer a ghost crying out from a concrete tomb. It was in the cry of the gulls, the rhythm of the tides, and the steadfast light of the distant buoys. She had not only solved his murder, she had fulfilled his mission. The coast was safe, his name was honored, and his story was now a permanent part of the landscape he had died to protect. The story of Samuel Vance is more than a tale of murder and corruption. It is a testament to the enduring power of a single, unwavering voice. It began with the fury of a hurricane tearing apart a monument to greed, and in doing so, unearthing a truth that had been entombed for 2 decades. The Gulf Stream jetty was built to tame the ocean, but the ocean, in its own time, had the final say. It returned a father's last words to his daughter, setting in motion a chain of events that proved that no secret is truly safe, and no lie is strong enough to withstand the relentless tide of truth. The conviction of Warren Croft was not the end of the story, but merely the final, public acknowledgement of a battle that Samuel Vance had already won the moment he chose to write down the truth, trusting it would one day find the light. Clara Vance chose not to keep the logbook. To her, its purpose had been fulfilled. It was no longer a private vessel of grief, but a public document of historical importance. In a quiet ceremony, she donated the leather-bound book and its waterproof satchel to the Louisiana State Museum, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibit titled The Lighthouse Keeper's Truth. Encased in climate-controlled glass, the book lay open to the page where her father had refused a bribe and sealed his fate. It was no longer just a piece of evidence, but a sacred artifact, a symbol of civic courage. Visitors would stand before it in silence, reading the steady, determined handwriting of a man who, armed with only a pen and his principles, had spoken a truth so powerful it outlasted his own life and the concrete tomb built to silence him. The ripples of Samuel's story spread far beyond the Louisiana coastline, becoming a catalyst for national reform. The Vance Act, a landmark piece of federal legislation, was passed with bipartisan support, establishing sweeping new protections for environmental whistleblowers and mandating independent structural reviews for all major public infrastructure projects. Inspired by Maya Singh's Pulitzer-winning series, investigative teams in other states began re-examining old contracts awarded to Gulfstream Holdings, uncovering a sickeningly familiar pattern of fraud, bribery, and intimidation. Samuel Vance's lonely fight had ignited a nationwide reckoning, his posthumous victory bringing down not just one corrupt man, but exposing the systemic rot he had exploited for decades. His single voice had become a chorus, demanding accountability from the powerful in a way that echoed across the country. 1 year after the verdict, Clara returned to the coast. She stood on the edge of the newly dedicated Samuel Vance Memorial Preserve, a sprawling expanse of protected wetland that was thriving once more. The last remnants of the Gulfstream jetty had been removed, its concrete rubble recycled into an artificial reef far offshore, a final poetic act of transformation from a symbol of destruction into a cradle for new life. The air was clean, filled with the cries of pelicans and the steady rhythm of the waves. The scar on the landscape was gone. The water was clear. Standing there, breathing in the salty air her father had loved, Clara felt the profound weight of his legacy, not as a burden, but as a living, breathing part of the world he had fought so fiercely to protect. She had found her own way to honor him. Clara left her commercial architecture firm and founded a nonprofit organization that provided pro bono design and engineering consultations for environmental groups fighting irresponsible development. She used her expertise in foundations and structures to help them challenge flawed permits and expose shoddy construction, fighting the same battles her father had, but with a different set of tools. She was no longer just building structures of concrete and steel. She was helping to build a more just and sustainable world. She was Samuel Vance's daughter, and his fight was in her blood, his integrity, the blueprint for her life. The quiet strength he had poured into his logbook now flowed through her, a current of purpose that was as deep and constant as the Gulf itself. Warren Croft would spend the rest of his life in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, a place famously known as Angola. Stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his name, he became inmate number 78,542, a forgotten ghost in a world he once commanded. His philanthropic donations were returned. His name chiseled off university buildings and hospital wings. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled into dust, its assets seized and liquidated to help pay for the demolition of the jetty and the restoration of the wetlands he had poisoned. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had been absolute. He had believed the gulf was deep enough to hold his secrets, but he had never considered that the deepest truths are not held by the water, but by the hearts of those left behind. The story of Samuel Vance is a powerful reminder that the fight for truth is often a marathon, not a sprint, and that sometimes justice needs a little help from the forces of nature. What he did took immense courage, but what Clara did, picking up that fight 20 years later, took a different kind of strength. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the secrets that lie just beneath the surface. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that one voice can make a difference. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Are there stories of local heroes in your community whose fight deserves to be remembered? As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the restored marshland, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. The hurricane that had started it all had been an act of chaotic destruction. Yet from that chaos, a deep and lasting order had been forged. The truth had been returned, a family's honor restored, and a community's future secured. Her father was no longer a ghost lost at sea. He was a permanent part of the landscape, his spirit present in the resilient marsh grass and the unwavering horizon. He had tended a light to guide ships through the darkness, and in the end, his own story had become a beacon, guiding a path to a justice that had once seemed impossible, proving that some lights can never truly be extinguished. The world is full of secrets buried in concrete, silenced by power, and forgotten by time. But the story of Samuel Vance leaves us with a lingering essential question. It reminds us that foundations are not always made of stone and steel. The strongest are built from courage and truth. His was a voice that the world tried to bury, a story that an empire was built to conceal. But it survived. And it makes you wonder, how many other logbooks are out there, waiting in the dark? How many other truths are just one storm away from being brought into the light?